I don't talk about it too often, but I actually went to college to get a creative writing degree, and while I was there, I almost exclusively wrote short stories. For those not familiar, a novel is typically at least 50,000 words, but a short story never runs longer than 10,000, often significantly less. One of the things you learn very quickly is that with so little space to work with, you need to have a very different mindset going into writing a short story instead of a novel. With only a few thousand words to work with, you need to use every part of the buffalo, so to speak. Every word or detail you put in there has to serve a purpose and be working towards something. You can see this ethos in short film as well, but it hasn't quite translated over to video games, and the result is that a lot of little 5-hour indie ventures, the closest equivalent the industry has to a short story, have narratives that can feel a little flat and forgettable. And today I want to talk about one cause I see for why this happens, and how the new murder mystery game, Return of the Obra Dinn, avoids that pitfall, and tells a compelling video game short story in the process. There's obvious differences between designing a video game and writing a book. In a video game, storytelling needs to be balanced by gameplay. For every little bit of text or every moment you spend focusing on plot, you also need a section where you're actually playing something. And it can be difficult to get all the diverse elements in a game to cohesively work together, especially when you have a massive studio with 100 different people, all of different disciplines, trying to put something together separately. So quite often, studios just don't try to do that. One of the most common structures for single-player games is to have long stretches of pure gameplay bookended by occasional plot points. If you've ever played an FPS campaign or a JRPG, you've experienced this. You get a few minutes of plot directing you to your next objective, then a 30-minute shooty bit or a series of a dozen random encounters, and then you get your next plot point. For your standard 20-plus hour game, this is a perfectly functional format. But for a little 5-hour game, this format just doesn't work as well for getting your narrative across. You wouldn't outline a short story the same way you would a novel, so why would you build a 5-hour narrative the same way you would build a 20-hour one? But you still see a lot of developers trying to do exactly that. A few months ago, I came across a perfect example in Cube 2. It's a pretty good puzzle game that came out earlier this year. I actually recommend picking it up. But its story is admittedly one of its weaker bits. It follows that same basic game structure, with 30-minute levels of puzzling bookended by brief radio conversations between the player and the game's two other principal characters. Those two characters both take a philosophical stance and spend the entirety of the game arguing their stance's reasoning, with all of it leading up to a final choice where you have to pick one side of the debate. Which of these two characters' worldviews do you agree with? You didn't know it from the start, but every conversation in this game was laser-focused on priming you for this one philosophical decision. Except when I got there, I had only just begun to understand what was even going on in the game, much less become invested in the other characters or the outcome of my decision. You can argue that maybe Cube 2's story was just poorly written, but I don't think the game's overall structure did it any favors. Cube 2 tries to tell this complicated story that needs to introduce and explain heavy philosophical themes and a bunch of science fiction world building on top of all the usual tasks of a story, like getting us to actually care about the characters. That's challenging to do under ideal conditions in any medium, and it's even harder to do in video games when you have to balance it with a ton of gameplay. And when you take an overall structure that only gives you maybe a dozen scenes to accomplish all of these goals in, it takes a difficult task and makes it a nearly impossible one. So, okay, you say. If the pitfall is just that we spend too much time engaging with only the mechanics and not enough with the narrative, then all we need to do is cut down the gameplay and include more time for the story and bam, we're golden. Problem solved. Well, okay, that's a good plan on paper, but then comes the question. How do you do that? That's where Return of the Obra Dinn comes in. First, a little bit about what this game is. Buckle up for some very light spoilers. Return of the Obra Dinn is a period piece mystery. It's set in 1807 when a British ship lost at sea unexpectedly returns home filled with nothing but its crew's skeletons. You're sent in to discover the crew's fate, and to help you out, you're provided with a handy-dandy pocket watch that allows you to witness the moment of a person's death. From there, you have to identify all 60 of the Obra Dinn's crew, how they died, and who, or what, killed them. And in the process, you'll piece together each crew member's death scene to create a cohesive narrative of sabotage, mutinies, ancient cursed relics, and a boatload of sea monsters. Pun intended. Return of the Obra Dinn's story is, to be honest, pretty straightforward and unremarkable. But the magic is in the way it's told, which is far more fascinating. To begin with, Return of the Obra Dinn already uses some unorthodox storytelling from a narrative standpoint. The game begins at the very end, with the Obra Dinn showing up with its crew already dead. The first scene you witness with the pocket watch is also the last scene chronologically, and from there the story unfolds almost entirely in reverse. In the very first scene, we see and hear people scuffling over some unknown MacGuffins.
They're at the bottom of the sea. That's a lie.
But we don't know what they do, or why everyone's interested in them. 30 minutes into the game, we witness a giant Kraken attack. But we don't know how or why the Obra Dinn ended up in such a terrible predicament to begin with. And in addition to the question of the crew's fate, these early scenes give us yet more mysteries to pursue. And the game's mechanics are all about hunting down the answers to those hooks. Normally, when people discuss mechanics as narrative devices, they talk about telling the story through a player's actions and what they contextually say about that character. But that's not what I'm talking about here. Instead, Return of the Obra Dinn's mechanics are literally how you discover the plot. Aside from just walking around on the ship, there are only 3 actions you can take to interact with the game. 1, you can use your pocket watch to witness someone's death. 2, you can use your journal to fill in the blanks of who a person is and how they died. And 3, you can check the book for existing information. Mechanically, your objective is just to fill every blank in the journal. And you fill those blanks in by discovering the story and making the appropriate inferences by cross-checking those discoveries against information already in the book, like crew manifests and illustrations. And your magic pocket watch basically functions like a chapter select on a DVD. As Lucas Pope, the man behind the game, put it in a recent interview with Rock Paper Shotgun, on the surface you think it's an exploration game, but then you realize that what you're really doing is using the book to figure shit out. By just making its mechanics all about interacting with the narrative, Return of the Obra Dinn gives that story a ton of space and flexibility that games like Cube 2 with their more standard gameplay loops just don't get to take advantage of. There is never a single moment where you're not actively engaging with the plot in some way, either watching it, filling in blanks in the journal, or just thinking about it as you try to logic together a solution. But there's also never any moment where you're disconnected from the mechanics either, whether you're flipping through the book or poking around inside a death scene. And the plot gives the mechanics heightened purpose as you use them to ferret out the answers to the game's many tantalizing mysteries. It's an infinite feedback loop where both of the game's primary elements elevate each other. Return of the Obra Dinn is not the only critically acclaimed game that does this. The Stanley Parable has a narrator telling you what to do, and the gameplay is focused on how you appease or defy that narrator's telling, and as the two of you bounce off of each other, you create the game's story. In Her Story, your primary way of interacting with the game is to type in search terms to watch video clips of police interrogations, which you then use to try and piece together what's going on. But it's a tall order to make your narrative and mechanics operate in perfect lockstep like this, even for a one-man band like Lucas Pope with total creative control over his project. And in fact, for a lot of games, it's probably impossible or detrimental to do so. There's another component to Return of the Obra Dinn's design that facilitates these two elements interweaving together so smoothly. It has an unconventional mechanic with a shorter gameplay loop. There's another reason you'll find a lot of games have those 30-minute gameplay sessions between plot points. An RPG dungeon wouldn't feel very imposing if you only got into 2 fights before you reach the end, and an RTS mission that ends in 5 minutes won't feel like much of a battle. A lot of the quote-unquote standard genres in gaming just don't translate very well to anything less than a 20 to 30 minute slice of gameplay. But Return of the Obra Dinn's mechanics are anything but traditional. And by basing itself around those unconventional mechanics, the game can still make its gameplay satisfy even with only a 5-minute core loop. For another example, think of something like Superhot, which takes standard FPS mechanics and adds a few special rules on top. Time only moves when you do, and unlike most shooters, you die in a single hit. Suddenly, a single fight with a half dozen dudes is a thrilling 5-minute encounter, and when you watch the live-action replay, the whole thing's over in 20 seconds. Can you imagine the same fight against just 3 or 4 dudes in Gears of War? It wouldn't be satisfying at all. Return to the Obra Dinn works along similar lines. Its core loop of viewing death scenes is no longer than 5 minutes. In fact, the first time you view each crew member's death, the game forcibly kicks you out of the scene after 60 seconds, never letting you dawdle and always pushing you to the next thing. Then you spend a minute pondering what you learned and maybe take a few notes, take 30 seconds to find the next body the game points you to, and you're back at the start of the loop. For me, that translated into 49 death scenes over the course of a 7-hour game, each of which gives you new information about what's going on in the story. Designing its core mechanics with a faster gameplay loop gives Return to the Obra Dinn similar opportunities to develop its plot to what longer games enjoy. And because of that feedback loop with the narrative that I already talked about, it remains satisfying while doing so. But if there's one important takeaway out of all of this, it's that Return to the Obra Dinn, as well as every other example I've given, tells its story differently. The real pitfall that Cube 2's narrative and so many other short games run afoul of isn't that they spend too much time on their gameplay, but that they just play things by the book. Popular game design trends are popular for a reason, and in a lot of cases, they are effective. But that doesn't mean they're one-size-fits-all solutions, and the 5-hour game is a really weird size to fit that we don't talk about as much as it deserves, considering how many short indie efforts are coming out these days. Just like you wouldn't make a short story the same way you make a novel, I think it's worth it to be conscious of how the length of a game affects how and what you can do with it. And currently, that's just not something we really think about, at least not really in these terms. So I hope that by highlighting an example of a game that does operate differently, we can acknowledge the unique challenges that come with designing a short game and how we can overcome them. And hopefully, when we start doing that, we'll get more great games like Return of the Obra Dinn. Hey, once again, I'm Alex, this is First 5, and thanks for watching all the way to the end. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, consider hitting that subscribe button. I'd love to do more of these, but, my time is kind of limited. So every little bit that gets me closer to being able to do this full time gets you closer to getting more regular releases like this one. If you're looking for more long-form content, I can point you to my Celebrating Games series, but my main meat and potatoes are my weekly reviews, where I try to find short games that respect a busy adult's gaming schedule. Check them out, and hopefully, I'll see you all next week.